Hello, and welcome to this very special July edition of Third Thursday at Hoover's. And thank you again for joining us for this lunchtime program. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Hoover Presidential Foundation, and we're here today at noon because we have a very special guest presenting with us today, all the way from Vienna, Austria, which is 7 hours ahead of us. We'll meet Dr. Mary Cox in a few minutes, but first I have some Hoover news I'd really like to share with you. The big news is the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum has reopened. You may now tour the museum exhibits Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 3 p.m. You'll need to go online and purchase your tickets in advance, as they are limiting the amount of people per hour as part of their COVID social distancing policy. Hoover Presidential Foundation members are still admitted free of charge, but still need to get those online tickets. And there's a spot on there when you would register for those. And of course, the other big news is we're proceeding with a capital campaign called Timeless Values, Modern Experience, where with your help, we'll raise $20 million to renovate the museum's permanent exhibit space and complete other upgrades. It's been nearly 30 years since the last upgrade, and it's sorely needed. You'll learn more about that at our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org. And with that, I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the library, historic site, and your favorite public library for special program offerings that will pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy. If you tuned in early, you may have seen a promotional video about First Lady Lou. It's a one-woman show that highlights the life of Lou Henry Hoover. And I have seen it myself, and it is outstanding. We're taking it on the road across to Iowa next month. We'll be in Coralville, Muscatine, Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Cedar Falls with the 90-minute program, and it's free for all to attend. Again, check our website for locations, time, and other details. And also in August, on the 6th and 7th, stop by West Branch and celebrate Herbert Hoover's birthday with us during Hoover's Hometown Days, a citywide festival with great family-friendly activities for all to enjoy. And you can learn more about that at hooverdays.org. And our next Third Thursday event is August 19th, back at 6 p.m., and features documentary filmmaker Derek Greer. He's written and produced documentaries on on the Civil War, Native America, and the popular culture for Discovery, the History Channel, PBS, and VH1. Again, visit our website or your favorite public library to register for that event. As I mentioned earlier, today's speaker is joining us from Vienna, Austria. She's presented here in West Branch before, and we're excited to welcome back Dr. Mary Elizabeth Cox, who will present Nutritional Inequality in Vienna, 1919 to 1922. Unfortunately, hunger did not immediately cease with the succession of hostilities during the war. Her presentation will explore the impact that reduced food supplies had on health of citizens in Vienna, as well as the nutritional impact on the city once the blockade was lifted and international food aid arrived. Dr. Cox received a PhD from the University of Oxford and is an assistant professor of international relations at Central European University in Austria. I'd like to encourage you all to enter questions for our speaker by using the Q&A feature on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during the program. Hello, Mary. It's great to have you joining us all the way from Vienna today, or I guess it says evening in your case.
Hi, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for tuning in. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Make sure everybody can see this. Make this full screen. So it's a pleasure to be speaking here today, or I guess speaking with you today. And I'm going to present to you some research that is ongoing. So this is by no means finished. I'm sort of in the middle. I was able to do a bit of archival work before the last year and a half. I had a lot planned that I wasn't able to do, but I think there's still enough that I want to show you some of my findings and talk to you about what it was like to live in Vienna after the First World War in terms of just the material quality of life, and some of the ways that different philanthropists and humanitarians responded to that. So just to give you an overview of the type of research that I do, I'm very interested in how war impacts food security and health of civilians. I'm very interested in how governments and civil societies seek to assist those in terms of human recovery. And I also like to think about the ways that we measure, the ways that we think about international aid and its effectiveness. Very often, people like to jump to long-term effectiveness of aid or the lack thereof, and sometimes we miss short-term impacts. That's something that I like to think about. So just to give you sort of an overview of today's lecture, today's talk. As was mentioned, food shortages in Vienna continued after the First World War. Vienna was an interesting place for many reasons. One is that it was really still a scientific center after the First World War. In particular, there was a children's clinic set up. I'm going to be talking about it a little bit today. That was just top of the line, one of the best in the world, where they really focused on children's nutrition. And this then was able to really help the city of Vienna recover many of its children. And also kind of bring this into the context of Vienna as a place had so many political changes that were going on as a result of the war and then in those first years following. So just very briefly, the archival work that I've done for this has taken place in Austria, in the United States, and in Jerusalem. In the United States, I was able to spend a little bit of time a couple of years ago at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, which is, I guess, where a lot of you are. So what impacted food supplies in Vienna before the end of the First World War, or by the end of the First World War? Some of these are very obvious, but I think especially for background, isn't necessarily First World War or Vienna, they're worth just mentioning. So one is that during the war, very early on in the war, the Vienna was sort of disconnected from the rest of the empire. And by that, I mean that the Hungarian half of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was to a large extent, it served as sort of the breadbasket for the rest of the empire. And once the war started, very, very, very quickly, those shipments of grains from the Hungarian half sort of slowed, or in some instances stopped, to the Austrian half, to Vienna. Second, very early on, there was a Franco-British blockade, which prevented trade, and particularly food, from making its way up across the Adriatic there. Also, and this kind of goes along with the empire sort of becoming disconnected, agricultural areas were occupied very early on in the war. So Russia moves into Galicia, in August of 1914, and with that, then there's a big disruption in terms of grains and food supplies. There's also a loss of mining areas. This matters because in order to move food around, you need coal to be able to move trains around. Also, the population in Vienna changed to some extent as the war continued, and then also, especially after the war, as people across the empire lost their homes, as there were pogroms, as they were escaping or moving across these new boundaries that were forming, there were a lot of refugees, and a lot of them moved to the capital, moved to Vienna for a variety of reasons. And then finally, there was a lot of inflation, and this again started during the war, but increased. So foreign aid and humanitarians and scientists started pouring into Vienna, after the war was over. And there are a number of different groups. These are just some of the big ones that were there. The Rädda Barnen, so that's the Swedish Save the Children, the Quaker Society of Friends, the American Friends Service Committee. So the top one is the English. I guess I didn't mention the other one, which is the American. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the American Relief Administration, the Red Cross, European Children's Fund, which is sort of part of the area I'll talk about in a moment. But there was a huge amount of sympathy targeted towards Vienna, towards this capital without an empire, this former capital without an empire. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about food that came in through the European Children's Fund through the ARA. So I moved to Vienna just a couple of months ago for my new job, and it's despite the times that we're living in, it's been really exciting and really fun to actually make Vienna my home. And indulge me as I show you a couple of photos that I've just taken over the last few weeks. I mentioned the ARA, and their first place of operation, so this was the American Relief Administration, was here, where this red dot is, on what is now Bösendorfer Straße, 13. So they make very fancy, expensive pianos, Bösendorfer Straße, and they have their shop there. This street was renamed in 1919. Before then, it was Gisela Straße, 13. So this is the same. This is a picture that I took of the street. And so this is, if you go look this way, this is Gisela Straße, Bösendorfer Straße, and then it's on a corner. This is Dumba Straße. And this is prime real estate. So this was actually a castle. If you look at the yellow line on the map, I like maps, so thanks for indulging me. This is the ring. So this was right in the center of Vienna. And then after a few months, it moved down the street here to Elisabethstraße 9. And this is another photo that I took. That's me waving at you. So I'm showing this for a few reasons. It's not just that I like maps, but of all the organizations that were operating in Vienna, as far as I can tell, in terms of the scope of food that was sent into the city, into the region, in fact, by far the greatest bulk of food was coming from the Americans, was coming from the ARA. And they were right in the middle of things, right where you would want to be. I mean, this is the first district. If you're extremely wealthy, if you're a prince or political leader, this would be a great, or anyone who can afford this would be a great place to live. You've got up here in the corner the Hofburg Palace, but I will move on from this map. So why did the US ship so much food? There was a huge US capacity compared to other places. So very quickly, the US increased grain and pork production by 40% by the end of the First World War. Why this was done, in summary, it was done in a large effort to support the Allies during the war, to support them with food shipments. American women played a huge role in lowering wheat and pork consumption, wheat and pork in particular, because these could be shipped easily. There were also price controls that were implemented, and that they guaranteed purchase of surplus after the war. So the United States definitely had the capacity to ship a lot of food. And there was also motivation. So there was definitely sincere philanthropy, this idea of American idealism. Food was seen as power if you had it, if you could distribute it. There was a capacity, as I already mentioned. There was also the need to sell off a surplus. So because the US government had promised to buy a certain amount of food, basically as much as the farmers could produce, then they needed to make that work. And some historians, these are all, I think it's combined, the motivation is combined. Some historians kind of focus on that there was this need or they would look bad. And I think that's fine. I like personally also to think about historians that also focus on this sincere desire for philanthropy. I think motivations are complex. And when you read people's diaries and journals, to a large extent, people really wanted to help. I think taking the context of the First World War, there was so much loss, there was so much misery, and many people responded by digging in their pockets and giving what they could. So just to jump gears for a moment, this is a graph of deaths of 15 and 20-year-olds civilians in Vienna. So this doesn't include any soldiers, and it also doesn't include statistics, at least as far as they were able to gather them. Maybe they were incorrect, but the people who gathered these statistics said that they also did not include deaths from Spanish flu. So these are total deaths, and what I want you to look at is how much they jump during the war, and then go back down for both males and for females. So death is one way of measuring well-being. There's other ways as well. This is a map that I created. This is what Vienna looked like in 1919. So just to give you some bearings, this is the Danube here. This is the first district. So as I showed you just a few moments ago, this is where the ARA had their headquarters, where they were distributing food. And this looks pretty similar today, but not exactly. There have been some changes. These different districts are numbered, and they are also named. And the old city of Vienna was the first district. And starting in the mid-19th century, these old walls that had been around Vienna, what was then Vienna, were ripped down, and they started building. So first of all, a big road and big stately homes and houses. And then these other districts started, or kind of, I guess they've been towns, they started becoming incorporated into the city of Vienna very quickly. And why this is interesting, besides the geography, is that many of these different places then had slightly different cultures, different things that you could say about them. For example, so this is the first district. The second district, Leopoldstadt, was very heavily Jewish. The 10th district, where I now work, Favoriten, this was a very heavily, I guess, workers area. There was a lot of brick building that went on, and some of these traditions still exist. And so when the wall started being torn down in the late 1850s, 60s, 70s, and things were built up, then these areas were brought in. So I give you this as a sort of reference, and I numbered them so you could make sense of what I'm going to be showing you now. So I showed you death before. I want to show you death rates that we have for 1919 to 1920. Not surprisingly, if you look at this map on the right-hand side, the central area, the first district, did not have a lot of deaths. And you can tell that because the lighter the area, the way I graphed this, then the fewer deaths. And this makes sense because there's a lot of, just a lot, and this is per 1,000 people, higher, you would expect a higher standard of living in a very wealthy part of the city. If you look to the west and to the south, and where it's darker, these darker shades, that suggests that there was actually a lot of, there was a lot more death. So if you just think about death rates, Vienna was not an equal city. These different districts, depending on where you lived, you had a higher chance of you're more likely to die or not. I also wanted to show population density. This has changed a little bit. The 10th is much more densely populated now. I thought that would be helpful. So what I did, and did this, I guess, a couple years ago now, but I collected locations of feeding centers operated by the ARA, or at least where they donated food. They were not all operated by the ARA, but where they were involved in Vienna. And separate from that, I also have data, anthropometric data, which I'll explain shortly, for 160,000 individual school children. So this represents about 70% of the entire school-age population. They were measured in some way. These are anonymized, but they're located at the district level. And then finally, just to help you understand, 128,000, almost 130,000 children were receiving a meal daily from the ARA by 1921. Out of a population, by population, I mean school-age children of 160, not 160, sorry, this is about 90%, but I don't have the number written down, so I need to be careful. Okay, so here at feeding centers and locations across Vienna, how it worked is they had these 13 large kitchens where they would cook the food. And then from those kitchens, food would then be distributed across the city. So how did it work? Aid workers, and this was across the board, not just the ARA, they wanted to serve meals to those who were in greatest need. So I sort of add these up in different ways. So I have, again, the total average. It probably changed a little bit day by day, but at least what was recorded, meals served per day according to district. And you can see that there were a lot of meals that were served to the west, to the south, also to the north, not so much in there. Food was served in the Hofburg. So I've been visiting the outside of the Hofburg looking for, this picture is actually taken from a pamphlet here. on the inside. This is the food. This is a more modern photo of the palace. But they kept the food here in the basement of the Hofburg because there was just so much for Vienna, and then elsewhere as well. Okay. You can see a couple of questions, and I'll get to those, I think, when I'm done, if that's okay. Here's an example of just one kitchen. I'm kind of showing places where I'm guessing if you've been to Vienna, you might know about. This is the Schloss Belvedere. And this one, palace, so food would come from the Hofburg, go to the different kitchens. The kitchen in Schloss Belvedere, they produced over 9,000 meals a day, roughly. And then those were distributed to 13 different feeding centers across the city. So it was very well organized. Foreign aid targeted children who were in greatest need. And now I kind of want to get to what a big important part of my discussion is, and that is how do we talk about effectiveness of aid? And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I don't think one way is necessarily better than the other. I think that they're complementary. But first of all, we can do it by just looking at what people said, what they thought themselves about the aid, how they felt about it, if they thought that they were getting more food or not. You can also use newspapers reports, photographs and films that show, changes in people's bodies. There's also political ways you can say was aid effective or not. What I'm going to focus on today is looking at anthropometrics and medical records. So this image on the right, I guess you're looking at small computers. I am too, but this is a Kinder auf Namensbogen. This is a record for a girl named Beate Bernstein. And in it, her height, her weight, her sitting height were taken. We also have information about her parents, their names, her address, where she lived, and then, how much she weighed, what was going on there, and then discussion privately. And the idea was that children who were the worst off, who needed the most, were then given food first. I should mention I'm focusing on children who are fed in Vienna, but there's other research which has come out recently, which is fantastic, about children who are sent to the countryside, to other countries as well, sometimes to sort of be fattened up for a few months or a few years and then would come back. But the records that I'm going to be showing you are just children's records that were taken in Vienna. Okay, so modern anthropometrics. Anthropometrics just means body measurements, people measurements. And this is back in the day, or now, I guess we use height and weight as a measurement of nutritional status. It's wise to account for both height and weight. You could have somebody who's very tall, but if you don't know their weight, you wouldn't necessarily know if they were undernourished or if they were fat. And the same would be if you were just looking at one. So it's nice to kind of sometimes use them separately and compare them, how they're going together. Or maybe you take something like the BMI. And in Vienna, there was something called the palaidisi, which was invented by this gentleman, Pierre, and it's sort of like the BMI. That's why I brought it up. So he took the cubed root of 10 times the weight in grams over the sitting height in centimeters. And his idea, basically, I've read he wrote textbooks about it. His idea was that most of human weight is in the center of the body, not in the limbs. And he came up with this idea that if you're a healthy adult, you should be 100 or over. If you're a healthy child, this means basically not malnourished, 94.5 and above. I hedge that a little bit because sometimes these change. Sometimes they said it was 95 and above, sometimes 94. And the reason it moved a little bit is that the idea was that the smaller your palaidisi score, the more nutritionally deprived you were. And this was not used in isolation from other measurements, but it was used so that children could be compared to other children very quickly, with the idea that with this simple number, if you could look at somebody and say, okay, that they have 93 or they've got a 92 palaidisi score, then that this child, all things equal, should be given food before somebody who's a 95 or a 96. This formula that I showed you would obviously be difficult for people to figure out on the fly. And so what Palaidisi did, or what Perquet did, is he produced these palaidisi tables that made it very easy for workers, for school teachers, for doctors who would go into schools, if they knew the sitting height and the weight, they could just put them together and then find the palaidisi and then score and then enter it into a table. This was important because, as I mentioned before, we had so much of the population, the school children age population in Vienna that was measured. So almost roughly 70% of all school age children, 6 to 14, had their palaidisi score taken. And just to put this into context, I mean, the sample size is huge compared to any other, for a single location, place I'm aware of, even in modern times when people have measurements. We usually don't get a sample size that is, more than 50% of the total population. So what do we do with this? So I did a little math, and one thing you can do is I showed you before those maps of Vienna sort of looking like, I showed you maps of death rates in Vienna, but what I showed you really was by district, and you could see the inequality in that, right? If somebody, all things equal, lived in the 1st district, they're much less likely to die than if they were living in the 10th district or in the 8th district. But you can also measure this statistically. So what I did is I looked at things in a few ways. So first of all, I took a measure of inequality for the first measurement. So when they first started feeding children, when the ARA moved into Vienna, first started feeding in. So they moved in May 1919 is when they opened shop in Vienna. Then they started feeding children, which you have the first measurement. And then tiles T is a way of measuring inequality spatially. So it's often used to measure real estate inequality. But because we're looking at a map, it works in this context as well. And then I measured it again a year later. And what you want to see, basically, these numbers don't matter too much, just that they're getting a lot smaller. So before I show you any further maps, we can see that the inequality, that the food aid that was going in, or at least if you don't think it was only aid, although I've shown you how many children were measured and also how many were being fed these additional meals, inequality across the city reduced in a very short amount of time in terms of nutritional inequality. So this is kind of the key map of my presentation. Again, this is Vienna. You have the 1st district here. These other ones that kind of glow around like rose petals. If you just look at the screen and kind of, you don't have to blur your eyes, but you can. The first thing I want you to notice is that it's a lot darker on this map on the left. So the measurement taken, the first children's measurement taken from February to July of 1920. And again, these darker districts, these darker patches represent higher nutritional deprivation. This meant that they had a lower palaidisi score. You can see some of these that are quite low. So you have 90. And again, this is the average. So there are kids who would have been even smaller within the district. I only have the data at the district level. I showed you Beate Bernstein's health, I can't speak English, I'm so sorry, her health document. But I don't have thousands of those. I actually only have about 30. And so for everybody else, I just know their district level. So this is really a lot of nutritional deprivation. This would be quite low. And again, we're not surprised. We just keep looking at this left map that the 1st district isn't too bad. But then if you look over here, the first thing you should notice, first of all, is that we don't have any of these black districts. We don't have any district that's black. We don't have any of these super dark districts. In fact, if you discount this top one, they're sort of a gray. So we can see already that there's less nutritional deprivation in Vienna as a whole, right? And however, there is still inequality. If there was total nutritional equality across the city, across Vienna, then this entire map would be a single color, right? If everybody was hungry equally, or if everybody was healthy equally, it would be a solid color, right? If there was no nutritional deprivation, it would be white. You would just see the boundaries of the districts. But we don't see that. But what we see is, okay, first of all, it appears that this aid, this massive amount of food aid that was being distributed by the ARA was effective to some extent. And it also appears that their efforts of at least trying to feed children by greatest need, which was their stated claim, rather than personal background or religious faith or anything else, was somewhat okay because the inequality is being reduced, right? So it's not only that the map on the right, which was taken at the second measurement, is whether we don't have any of these extreme palaidisi scores in here for averages, but we also are getting closer. We're getting closer to the same color. And so for me, this would be one way of measuring the effectiveness of international aid, is if the aid givers are saying we want to feed kids based on need, that's our prime measure, our prime goal, to help children regardless of who they are based on their actual need. Then if you're reducing nutritional inequality, then that would be one way of measuring effectiveness. Equally, the fact that everybody in the city is doing better, every district is doing better than they were before, would be another way of measuring nutritional, or measuring the effectiveness of international aid, even though this isn't a very short period. So why does being so precise matter? I've said this before in other talks, but I really believe it, that first of all, it allows us to know what actual conditions were like across a single city, across Vienna. Vienna is unique for many reasons. I kind of went through very, very quickly, but politically there's so much going on. It's also unique. It's just a wonderful city. But it's also unique because of the amount of data that we have for this place. And it's also unique because of how different these different districts or these different bezirke, the different cultural histories that kind of go into them. And so it's fascinating to actually be able to zoom in on a single place and see what was it like where you were living. There's similar work sometimes economists do now by zip code in the United States. If somebody lives in a certain area, what's their likelihood of having different health problems or different crimes or whatever. And you can see this in Vienna in a similar way. And we can see this in a period of crisis when there's so much going on. How are they able to respond? So it allows us to see comparisons and also to measure biases of aid givers. This is something I want to move into more. So for example, there was a fear, especially by a lot of Americans, of this sort of spread of Bolshevism. We know that in Vienna, actually, in the 1920s, we got Red Vienna, so this fear was not without founding, I guess. So I have the address of where the Communist Party had their house. I mean, was it such that the aid givers said they wanted to give by aid, but they actually were sending more food to more, politically active areas or less? At least from the main map, the main study that I did, if there was, it doesn't seem to have been too big. Inequality was reduced. And then finally, being precise shows respect. I don't have too many pictures of children in here, but of course, everybody we're talking about, I'm talking about, we're individuals. One thing that's been a real pleasure, I would say, over the last couple of years is that I've had the opportunity to meet people whose parents received this type of food aid. And it's been a joy to meet them and see how they remember this. So I will end there. I've got this film. This was taken in Vienna, I think 1921. This is in a children's home. Just sort of as just a reminder, I mean, Vienna, so many of their children were fed. And it's just incredible what was able to happen there. So I think I'll finish there and take questions. Thanks for your time. Happy to answer anything.
Well, Mary, thank you very much. That's a great presentation. And we, as always, have questions from our audience on there. And Rebecca asked a question: in what ways did American women reduce the wheat and pork consumption? And was that specifically in order to have more available for humanitarian aid?
Great, thanks for that question, Rebecca. So there were a few ways. So first of all, they were put under a lot of pressure. And maybe you could say it wasn't always welcome, this pressure. There was a lot of pressure and sometimes they complained. I mean, during the First World War, there were also a few like sort of hunger marches in places like Pennsylvania, where people were complaining they didn't have enough food. But really they came under a lot of political pressure. So there was an idea that the woman was in the home, she was the main cook, and it was her duty to reduce consumption of things like wheat and pork. And the way that that was done, there were articles written in like, I think Good Housekeeping. I found an article, maybe even written by Herbert Hoover, encouraging women, encouraging them to be patriots and eat less wheat, eat less meat. There were cartoons that were published. They also had these little so the ARA, I mentioned all these institutions, but during the war, the equivalent was sort of the US Food Administration. And they could put these US Food Administration little placards in their window of their front house saying, you know, I support the war. So that was a lot of how it worked. There were never, in terms of making women or individual families reduce their consumption, there were no laws that worked that way. Herbert Hoover especially was against that. But I would say that well-placed peer pressure was a big way that worked. And many went along with it. There are also women who did not appreciate this peer pressure, who said things like, how are we supposed to make do with this, you know? But there was less consumption overall. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. So what role did Herbert Hoover play, maybe specifically in food aid to Vienna?
So this is a great question, and something I'm getting, I mean, I'm speaking to the Herbert Hoover Foundation. I'm guessing a lot of you are big Herbert Hoover fans. I mean, he was the head of the ARA. So when you're opening up these books that they published, I say books, they're sort of like pamphlets on food aid in Vienna, 1921, 1922, 1923. They've always got a picture of, usually they've got a picture of Pierre Kay, this head of the children's clinic who invented the palaidisi. And then on the other side, there's a picture of Herbert Hoover. And so he did a lot of things publicly. Also, behind the scenes, this is something I've seen a little bit of, but I don't fully understand yet. For whatever reason, Vienna people had a lot more sympathy for Vienna than they did, for example, for Germany. They both had been enemies during the First World War. Herbert Hoover championed getting food into Germany as soon as he could, basically after the war was over. But in Vienna, they actually got food a little bit earlier. And I have letters of Herbert Hoover writing to President Wilson and just sort of planning it. November 8th, 1918, he's orchestrating getting food in there. And I don't know if it's because he did this for other places as well. I don't know if it's the political climate. People were more sympathetic to Vienna than they were to other places. But I think the comparison is interesting. That's something I'm trying to figure out. So he put on publicly pressure, and then also privately was trying to get it in. I would say.
Okay. Very good, very good. Well, Vienna is known for its rich cultural history. Is the food shortages at this time, are they reflected in any of the novels, plays, art, etc., like that?
Great question. Yes, and some maybe. I mean, I might be stretching the thread a little bit thin, but if you've heard of The Hunger Artist by Franz Kafka, this is one of the short stories that he wrote. He wasn't in Vienna right then, but he'd been there the years previous. He kind of writes this, it's a very sad story about, I don't know if we need to recount the story, but basically a guy who starves himself. He's sort of seen as like an animal. There were also children's art exhibits that were distributed across the world. When it moved across the United States, the children drew image pictures of themselves being hungry, getting food, other pictures. One thing is that it seems like, especially with World War II, a lot of the stuff was lost. So this was something a colleague of mine pointed out just a couple of weeks ago. There was a street in Austria that was named for Herbert Hoover. And then very shortly after the Anschluss, this name was changed very quickly away from Herbert Hoover. And so it seems like a lot of the stuff has been lost. I showed you those. I'm sorry if I'm giving too long of answers to these questions. Maybe they're a bit winding, but I showed you those pictures of where the offices of the ARA were opened up, right, in 1919. And what's interesting is there's not a plaque there. There's not a statue. The street is named after, well, it's named after the pianos, and I don't think we can change that. But the other street is named after some other guy. And something that I'm hoping to be able to do while I'm in Vienna is maybe help people be more aware, because it's such a rich and wonderful memory. So the long answer is yes, there were responses. I think a lot of them have been forgotten. I would say in the last 5 years, especially with the centenary of the end of the war, there's been greater interest. And I think this is a great opportunity to try to build on some of those.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you. So we also have a question. What did the typical school meal consist of in Vienna then?
I don't have it in front of me. So there were menus, and a lot of the food that was shipped from the United States were things that wouldn't spoil. So you had dried beans, there was wheat. Meat wasn't always on the menu, but it was there, condensed milk. But what's sort of, I say interesting, but also kind of weird about Vienna, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, but Perquet, who was a smart guy, he invented this whole system of measurement, the palaidisi. He also invented a whole system of nutrition called the NEM, N-E-M. And what he did, he was so creative, is he said, instead of comparing, instead of measuring food, the value of food by the calorie intake, we can compare these to actually the unit of milk that it would be. And it sounds mind-boggling now, but he converted every food type into basically the same unit would be in the nutritional value of milk. It sounds weird, but after thinking about it, Vienna had huge milk shortages. Children needed milk. He had this clinic where they had children who were just so hungry or diseased that were in there. And with major food shortages, you can see why somebody might take the intellectual leap to try to figure out how much nutritional value is in all of these different things compared to milk. So in terms of what the meals were, I mean, they changed sometimes, but I wish I'd included, there's photographs of these giant pots, these women that are cooking in these big kitchens. And they were a lot of times just sort of boring, I would say boring food. Maybe that's too critical. They tried to make, they tried to make them delicious. There were instructions on that. In Germany, I have this in my book in Germany, but children they had a lot of chocolate, sort of rice pudding, which sounds delicious. I think they had some of that in Vienna as well.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, Sarah writes, she goes, you stated that precision matters in determining biases. What biases did you find in the distribution of aid in your studies?
So that's a great question. You're making me think.
This is a tough crew. They ask tough questions.
Great. Well, I think I was expecting to see, in terms of food distribution, maybe a little more bias. So looking at records from the history of the Jewish People's Museum, something that really struck me when I read these. So I should say a lot of these records were in Vienna, and then after World War II, they were shipped to Jerusalem. So that's why I went there. And so these are records from the Joint. What I was surprised by is that people would write in to say, request aid for different reasons. But there was a real interest in showing that you were a true Viennese, that you were not one of these recent, I don't want to say maybe refugee or recent settler into Vienna. And so a lot of times when people were requesting aid, or even when they were then recommending aid, they would have these little notes of, and this is a real Viennese. I think you can see that sort of in relationship to today, this sort of claim of nationality, even though it was a big empire. So there were biases there. There were those who tried to go against them. Um, trying to think what else in terms of the ARA. I think that there was, I really get the feeling that people were trying as much as to do as much as they could. So I just focused on the school children. The Swedish Red Cross was also there. They were giving food to mothers with new babies or pregnant women with small children. So I don't know if their bias as much as difference, but they're trying to get. I thought of another one, and then I'll let you go to the next question. There was and this is in the ARA and also the joint. There was an intense desire so far that I've seen, because I still need to see more records, but what I've seen so far, there was an intense desire not to change the social status of people. So they wanted to give food to everybody equally, but for example, in the distribution of clothes, which is something I didn't speak about, you didn't want to give expensive clothes to somebody who wasn't wealthy, and you didn't want to give workers clothes to somebody who was wealthy. There was a desire not to change this. And I think you could see that as a sort of bias. Maybe it was clever for different reasons. Maybe they didn't want to be too politically involved, but this seemed to matter a lot to people, that we're not changing your social structure. We're kind of helping you sustain what's already there.
Okay.
So it gives another term of bias.
Very good. Very good. Well, Steve writes, he says, Dr. Cox, what can we extrapolate from your research that international aid experts and institutions to contemporary regions such as Afghanistan, Haiti, et cetera, even how we distribute COVID-19 vaccines to badly needed areas, both abroad and in the USA? Do you see anything in your research that would be good tidbits to bring forward to modern day?
Okay, great. That's another great question. Sure. I mean, there's a lot. So, I mentioned Herbert Hoover. You asked, that he was on one side, and then this other Austrian, Perquet, was on the other. But there's a real need to work with local people. So, the United States provided a ton of the food, but they depended very closely on the relationships that they had with people that were there. So their goal to feed all children, regardless of need, this was also what the Austrians wanted, and they saw this. But to work, they needed, they didn't only need, I want to say, so there's two parts. So they didn't only need the Austrians' bodies to work. They didn't only need the women, and they were mostly women, to be cooking these meals in the kitchen. They didn't only need school teachers and doctors to then measure children to see how they were doing. They also needed to listen to what was needed by the Austrians. And these relationships are very interesting. This is kind of sometimes where you get into the drama of aid givers. One thing that I found that was really superb, so the first American sort of head in Vienna was a young, I can't remember if it was Yale that he went to or Harvard, but he was a young, like 28-year-old PhD in classics. And he was distributing food. And from what I can tell you, he did a fine job, but he rubbed Perquet the wrong way, who was the Austrian guy in charge. Again, you're trying to figure out exactly what happened, but it looks like he reduced the pay of some of the Austrian workers and gave more to the Americans. And Perquet was so upset by this, he wrote a letter saying, if you don't get rid of this guy, I'm quitting. And the Americans, Herbert Hoover, they could have said, oh, well, he's our guy. We've had him there for 6, we know the best way. What are you saying? But instead, they very quietly and very quickly got rid of this guy instantly. They shipped him back to the States because they wanted, I think, not just to show the respect, but I think they also understood that they needed to be partners with the Austrians. And this was not always perfect, so I don't want to paint a picture of that. But I think this was one instance where they did that. So there's not only this idea of you work with locals, but you really need to actually listen and take what their needs are, what their wants are, in a huge way. So how does it work with COVID-19? First of all, I think aid givers feel this way anyway, but there's this need to try to be equal, to give, to be seen as being equal, to try to give to those in greatest need. And then second, maybe this is even more important. So if you think about the First World War, this was a time of huge tragedy, right? And there was so much need. And Americans, it was not only the government, there was also many people who donated as individuals. It's a huge effort, stepped up and had this capacity, and then made sure that others also had it, even our former enemies. And I would say we're in a similar situation today in many ways, in that the United States has a unique capacity. We have more vaccine than anybody. We have so much vaccine that not everybody's even taking it who has the option. Whereas we have places like in India or in Africa where people desperately need it. And I strongly believe that we need to use this capacity to help others, and obviously it helps us too. So I don't know. I could maybe talk more about it, but that's just on top of my head what I would say to that.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, of course, then another question we have is, do you think that Herbert Hoover, as an orphan, had a special empathy for hungry children in Europe? And then maybe in your estimation, how does he rank as a philanthropist?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. Sure. I mean, I have to say I'm not a historian just of Herbert Hoover. I came across him because I'm interested in aid
Sure.
for other projects as well. I think he did say somewhere that he wished, he's quoted by someone as saying he wished he'd never been involved with this because it was so difficult. But I think that's, again, maybe it's just my personality. I think that's a little bit too critical. He was so good. I think George Nash is right. He was such a genius at organization, right? And he used that for good. So did being an orphan influence that, to help that? Probably. I'm just more astounded at what he was able to actually do. And yeah, for me, I get frustrated when people focus on the negative, but for me, in a way, it doesn't even matter so much what the motivation was. What matters is that millions of people got food that wouldn't have otherwise. I don't subscribe to this idea that he only did it for political reasons because he wanted to be present later on. I think Brandon Little, another historian, wrote well about this. I agree with him. But also, and maybe it's just, I don't care if somebody's going to feed so many people, they're a hero in my, I shouldn't say this as a scholar, but I mean, he was just incredible. So how does he rank? Well, I would agree with other historians who see, he saved more lives, at least in the last 100 years, or he had to influence more than any other person. So, hooray for Herbert Hoover is what I would say to that.
Okay, well, very good. Well, speaking of Brandon Little, he's got the next question. So his question is, some scholars have faulted Hoover for prioritizing American food in alleviating shortages in Europe instead of other international food sources. But it seems clear in your presentation that even the peripheries of cities beyond distribution nodes suffered more severely. Would you agree that the tyranny of time and distance and maybe urgency made it sensible to ship food from the closest sources possible?
Great question. Can I read? Is there any way I can see the questions? There's so many parts to that. Let me see.
Oh, if you click on the Q&A, they're right up there in that box.
Okay.
You can.
I don't know if places beyond the city suffered more. I actually don't know that. So, and maybe that was a mistake in my presentation. I mean, I focused only on Vienna, but the food that was stored in the Hofburg did go out to other places. Yeah, I mean, going back to Herbert Hoover, I think some have argued convincingly that he was a bit controlling. He wanted things done in his way. Again, I think he did it great. Would it have been better if they had used food that was closer by? Gosh, I have to think about that. I would say that in terms of the amount of food, I think the US had so much, but maybe I need to get back to Brandon. I think that's a good question and I need to think about it more. So
Okay.
thanks.
Well, very good, very good. Well, I'm going to give the last question here is, when did the food draft program begin where Austrians living in the USA could purchase food for relatives in Austria? And what impact did this program have on providing food?
Great question. Thanks. So just to give context to people who don't know about the food drafts, they had it set up so people could go in and you could go to a bank or a post office and you could buy for a certain amount of money different size of a food draft, and then the person that you wanted to get that food draft, they would receive it on the other end, and they would then take that to one of these sort of, I guess, ARE warehouses, and they'd be given a certain amount of flour, sugar. These were heavily advertised, and they even had kosher ones, which I think is pretty cool. So it wasn't only, if you didn't want to, if you needed food that was kosher. How many and when did they start? Dang it, I think either late, I think 1919, but maybe 1920. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact date. And there were a lot of them, and these would have then been affecting entire families. You could also send them, for example, to schools or universities or groups. And one reason that they were so important is that they prevented a lot of, or at least the way they were advertised, is that they were advertised as preventing a lot of theft and loss. So, with food in such high demand, shipping a food parcel all the way to Vienna from Milwaukee or wherever you were back to your relatives or people you cared about, there was a good chance it might have gotten stolen along the way. And so this was sort of a safety measure. And I don't have the total amount on the tip of my head, but I know at least for Europe as a whole, they did have a big impact. So I'm assuming it would as well, but I can't give a percentage on that.
Okay, well, very good. Well, very good. Well, and that's all the time we really have for questions for now. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mary Cox for joining us tonight and for an excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. I'd encourage you all to come visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings, and also to get your tickets online and tour the museum now that it's opened. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is also ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. And of course, don't forget to tune in next month for another great Third Thursday program. On behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, Mary, we'd like to thank you once again. And we thank everyone for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Thank you very much.